world is changing. America is changing. Europe is changing. And the people start getting in charge again.
The right-wing parties of Europe started 2017 with a joint press conference, emboldened by the previous year's rise of populism that sent shockwaves through the establishment.
The genie will not go back into the bottle.
These right-wing leaders have their sights set on elections across Europe that, if they win, could spell the end of the European Union.
What we're seeing with the rise of populism is a rejection of the established political class, of the political elites, if you like. And so the old ideas of left versus right, conservative versus liberal, have, at least to some extent, been replaced by a new scale of the establishment and the elites versus the common people.
We want our orders back, we want our passports back, we want our country back.
Populism is a movement that is entirely grounded in a sense of anti-establishment feeling. It's about us versus them. And there are two different others. One are the political elites that have presided over globalization. The other is the exclusionary outside. And this is where we're starting to see the link in with the anti-immigration sentiment.
I will build a great, great wall on our southern border, and I will have Mexico pay for that wall.
There are those who fear that the appeal to nationalism and anti-immigrant emotions hold echoes of the 1930s.
I think we're definitely right to be concerned about the parallels between some of the language that we're seeing now and the language of fascism.
Don't listen to the media. Don't listen to the weasels in Washington. You are a fascist. Get your flag off me. Dude, why do you come over here cursing like that? Because you're a fascist. You are the scum of humanity.
One attempt that the established order has made is describing populists as racists or fascists. But of course, for their supporters, they don't see it as racism. They see it as patriotism. They don't see it as fascism. They see it as being a strong leader.
I'm supporting Trump because I am fed up with big business and big banks running and setting the agenda in Washington, D.C.
He's not one of the establishment. And he speaks like we the people.
What Trump did manage to do was to switch off from politicese and speak in a different language, which is what people were desperately trying to hear.
Our country has been tongue-tied by political correctness for many years now, and he has single-handedly untied the tongues of America.
The post-2008 populist movements cannot necessarily be classified as right or left-wing. In Spain, the indignados, the indignant, protesting over soaring levels of youth unemployment, grew into Podemos, a left-wing party that has challenged established parties.
The old ideas of left or right, liberal versus conservative, have been replaced, at least to some degree, by parties who cannot be characterised in those terms, but they do have populist sentiment in common. And so you can have parties of the left, for instance Syriza and the Five Star Movement in Italy and Podemos, but they actually share many things in common with the kind of movements that would be characterised as right-wing.
One of the reasons why in Greece and Spain the level of anger on the street and the street protests and the riots and the burning of cars and so on occurred is because the depth of their economic and financial position was far worse.
An economic crisis absolutely feeds into a social and cultural crisis and creates the perfect storm for populism.
In Greece, the anger that expressed itself in street riots over the catastrophic collapse of the economy resulted in the election of the left-wing populist party, Syriza.
Public sector workers weren't even getting paid, and in some areas their savings had been completely and utterly destroyed. So what you've got there is a kind of meltdown of an entire order.
But ultimately, the Greek government, which had been brought to power on a populist anti-establishment mandate, was forced to go begging to the establishment itself, the financial institutions of the IMF and the European Union. And here it met the limit of its power and was forced to impose the same austerity its people had voted against.
It did not have a model of Greek economy, which was, if you like, self-reliant. It was still within the international system. In order for them to pull out of that international system would have caused a great deal of short-range, even worse situation.
The European Union has become the focus of anti-establishment anger, painted as taking away the sovereignty of member countries and imposing the euro single currency that has crippled the poorest economies. It was this sentiment that fueled the Brexit debate and is now being used by Marine Le Pen in her bid to become president of France.
The difference is not between right and left anymore. It's between patriots and pro-globalization.
If Le Pen wins, she says France will get rid of the euro, and she promises a referendum on EU membership, unless there is significant reform.
The French people among all European nations are the ones who are most afraid of globalization. They don't see only a very slim number sees any advantages personally for themselves. Marine Le Pen has been very clever to feed into these fears.
The terror attacks in France, including the atrocities at the Bataclan concert hall and the Bastille Day celebrations in Nice, have fueled anti-establishment anger.
The mood in France right now is an acute malaise. We're seeing appalling levels of trust in government, a real sense of pessimism about the nation's prospects.
Something like 75% of French citizens expect sooner or later another terrorist attack.
Marine Le Pen is drawing in people not just from the hard right, but also from the hard left.
So how far could the rise of populist parties go in changing Europe's political landscape in 2017?
At YouGov, we've conducted a survey into authoritarian populists, people who are anti-EU but pro-strong defence as part of the foreign policy. They are anti-human rights as a concept and anti-immigrants and immigration. Now, France had around 2/3 of its electorate saying that they supported to at least some degree these authoritarian positions. If Marine Le Pen could unite those authoritarian populists, she could be extremely successful.
YouGov's research in Germany, where Angela Merkel faces elections in September, shows rather different results.
Contrast that with Germany, where 1 in 5 being authoritarian populists is not enough to win an election. But of course, in their coalition system, it could be that Alternative for Deutschland, the authoritarian populist party in Germany, could win concessions from the main parties.
Having taken more than 1 million asylum seekers and awaiting many more, awaiting families as well, is going to cause huge problems in Germany.
Anti-immigrant feeling in Germany has led to large rallies led by the far-right group Pegida.
There has always been a populist far-right movement in Germany. It's just starting to gain some traction now after the migration crisis.
Germany is a country that, like no other country in Europe, has experienced the horrors of fascism, the horrors of hatred, the Holocaust. I'm pretty optimistic that Germany will not go for a populist government, that Germans will not vote in September 2017 the Alternative für Deutschland, which is a populist right-wing party.
There are checks and balances in place in Europe to prevent a lot of populists coming to power on their own.
Populism has overturned the political expectations of decades, partly because large numbers of people are voting who have never voted before.
One of the interesting changes we've seen as a result of some of these populist movements is that people who previously had not engaged with the political process, who had not been comfortable with the established order of career politicians, are now, in some cases, starting to engage.
Traditional parties have not known how to respond, and some analysts believe their very survival is now threatened.
These parties themselves have become politically exhausted. They've become emptied of content, which is why so many of them can just disappear from one day to the next. I mean, look at the way the French Socialist Party is just, disintegrating in front of our eyes.
So what happens when populism wins the campaign and takes power? In Britain, the road to Brexit looks increasingly rocky. There is already talk in Scotland of another referendum on independence. And in the United States, all the talk is of chaos within the new administration.
Trump is in a really difficult position here now. He has to drive economic growth. He has to create those jobs in the Rust Belt states that he promised.
The difficulty that the populist movements have is that eventually, if they're going to win, if they are going to triumph, they need to then deliver.
The fear is that if you say populist parties win, they will not deliver, because their task is too complex.
We're already seeing a little bit of an anti-Trump effect in the polling around the upcoming French and German elections. We're seeing that voters are starting to turn back to more moderate candidates. And I think that definitely reflects a sense that Trump and his populist agenda, when in power, can actually be quite a terrifying thing.
But could the wake-up call be good for the political establishment? And is populism here to stay?
To me, populism is something which is a big warning. But I don't see the elites having actually heeded that warning up to now. And they seem to be carrying on as if they've been somehow wronged.
On balance, I'm really glad that we're seeing all these changes. I'm really glad that the existing political status quo is unraveling and that there's a demand for new solutions.
It could do a lot of damage until people finally understand that this is not the recipes that will solve all their problems and solve all their anxieties. Because until that day, the destruction can be complete.
Ultimately, people really will want, in the long term, stability and security from their government. We're in a period of change and upheaval now, but I don't think populism is the new normal.